1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, and welcome to the Vininspo podcast with me, Ed Merrison. This is where wine is a travel experience. Join us as we pick up bits and pieces, make new friends, and create memories that make our future interactions with wine, people, and places all the more meaningful and fun. My guest on this second ever episode of the podcast is Toronto-born Master of Wine Andrea Pritzker. Andrea is a Sydney-based wine educator whose own learning journey has taken her all over the world and right to the top. I caught up with her when she was in the Hunter Valley, New South Wales for a flying visit. We spoke about literally finding love in Bordeaux, why Hunter Semillon should be on your radar, attending the greatest wine school on earth, the hard-earned letters that appear after her name, and career pivots brought on by glandular fever, garden leave, and 9/11. You'll find more context on the educational exploits in the show notes, but for now, here's my interview with Andrea. I started by asking her whether wine was in her blood.
I come from a family of scientists, actually, and I am the black sheep of that family when it comes to science. So I did high school sciences and was planning on a career in marine biology. I did actually start a Bachelor of Science in biology, and I lasted an entire semester, and then I got glandular fever and had to drop all of my subjects and kind of lay in bed for about 8-9 weeks over the Christmas holidays. And that was a mixed blessing. It was really rotten to have that, but it was really positive in terms of lots of thinking time. It really made me realize that I actually wanted to study more of a liberal arts degree. And so I got better and then went back to uni, but I switched my major entirely to a Bachelor of Arts in European Studies. And then I was much happier and never looked back.
What kind of stuff in that degree did you find particularly interesting?
It was a really broad degree, everything from sort of marketing, consumer behavior and economics, as well as German language and history. And I loved all of it. I love that diversity of subject matter. And I also loved the fact that I was at a university that's actually an agricultural university as well. So all of the cool kids at the university were farmers. And I grew up in the city. And for me, it was really great to meet people who'd grown up in the countryside and had a very different way of looking at life.
Your surname, Pritzker, harks, I suppose, in some way to Europe.
Most people think that name is German, but it's actually not. It's Ukrainian. But I am, I think, fourth, fifth generation Canadian. And the Ukrainian Pritzkers left in the late 1800s and moved to both Canada and the US. The US family did very well. They're all multi-billionaires. And the Canadian family are still working for a living. It was Pritzky when they left the Ukraine, and they added an R when they got to North America to make it sound more German, more Western European, and that was very effective. And when I travel in Germany and I give my last name, people presume it's a German name.
So when did you first sort of come to wine? Was it from hanging out with the agricultural kids in Canada, or did that all come later?
It came a little bit later. I was studying at university. My best friend, her parents had just moved to Niagara-on-the-Lake. And she and I would get together on uni breaks and go and visit her parents and then go and visit wineries, which maybe as a university student at 22, 23 was a bit of an odd thing to do. So we would go and visit these wineries and I loved it. I thought it was super interesting tasting these wines, learning a little bit about how they were made and the climate there. And then I ended up moving to Germany as part of my undergraduate degree. So I ended up in Heidelberg. And it was there, I think, that I really got the bug fully because it was the first time I could actually afford to buy wine. So we used to go to the Pennymarkt. This is pre-Euro. So it was in Deutschmark. And we used to be able to buy, Chianti or Rioja, Crianza, Rioja Reserva for 5 Deutschmarks, which for a student was just phenomenal. And for a Canadian student, even more so because wine in Canada was already reasonably expensive.
Did you particularly love the German white wines when you started living in Heidelberg? Was that just an instant love?
Yeah, and I was really fortunate because the university put on wine tours for the students. And so you could opt in to go, to one of the wine regions for the day, and they would take you to a few different wineries. And so I did quite a few of those, and I absolutely loved them. And I remember being really taken with Weissburgunder, so Pinot Blanc. they were making oaked styles of Weissburgunder back in those days. And I thought, how amazing, this wine tastes almost like a Chardonnay, which in retrospect is because of the way it was made. And so I was like fascinated that you could get two different grapes that would taste similar. And how did that happen? And the winemaking was, as I now know, sort of, very similar: barrel fermentation, lees stirring, oak maturation, all of that kind of stuff.
And when did you finish that degree?
So I finished up in 1999, and then I was looking for a job. I had returned to Canada. I had applied for a job with the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, which is the only place to work in Ontario in wine. It's a monopoly, and that's it. And I didn't get a job with them, actually. I ended up getting a full-time job in travel, which I thought was quite attractive as well. And then I managed to get a part-time job at the same time at a small wine shop that only sold Canadian wine. And they were allowed to exist alongside the LCBO because of some loophole in the law. So I started a retail job with the Wine Rack, which still exists. And I worked there part-time alongside my full-time travel job for that year. The Wine Rack job was super interesting because they put me on a course to learn all about Ontario wine, which was great. But then I put myself through an introductory course, which would be today equivalent to WSET level 2 at the local community college. And that started every Saturday morning at 10 a.m. And I was there with bells on every session. So I knew I was pretty dedicated. I thought it was the best thing ever. I absolutely loved it. So I knew I really wanted to make it my career. But at the time, I had this job in travel, and that seemed to be more where my career was headed. But I was very fortunate in that the travel job offered me a transfer to Amsterdam. And so I took it thinking, one, another great travel adventure, and two, I'd be closer to vineyards in Europe, though I ended up in Amsterdam from January 2000. And during that time, I did WSET level 3, or the equivalent. It was called the higher certificate back then. And I did that by correspondence because, online learning wasn't a thing in the year 2000. So they mailed me the book, and they mailed me the sort of assignments, I think, or assessments. And then I flew to London to write the exam.
Yeah, clearly very dedicated by then. Do you remember anything, from those very early days, perhaps as a student, when you were turning up on Saturday mornings, potentially a little bit hungover, but still very keen? Any sort of early epiphanies in terms of, wines that you had, or even educators that you had that made you really sure that this was something that you could dig down further into?
Yeah, that educator, my first educator at the community college in Toronto, he was Italian, and he was very passionate about Italian wine. And I remember he would do a bit more of a deep dive into the wine regions of Italy compared to some of the others. And so I was really picking up on that level of interest and passion from him. He served us a Nasti Spumante, sweet, low alcohol, bubbly, the bestseller of the 1950s and 60s and early 70s probably. And he said, in Italy, this is a birthday cake wine. It's sweet, it's low alcohol, and it goes really well with birthday cake. And we even give a small amount to the children, he said, which shocked, the Canadian no end, because, our legal drinking age in Ontario is 19. It's not even 18. That has stuck with me all that time. And I also remember having my very first Fino sherry and absolutely hating it to the point where I almost ran from the room to spit it out of my mouth as quickly as I possibly could. I thought, how on earth does anyone drink this stuff? And now I really, really like Fino and Manzanillo.
Yeah, and I dare say that you've seen a similar reaction maybe in some people, and even the trajectory of not liking it and then loving it.
Yeah, I mean, every time I teach and I pour a Fino or a Manzanillo for a level 2 class or even a level 3 class, it's always quite a divisive style. And I always tell them, well, don't write it off. Try it a few times. Try it in situ in Spain with tapas, with food, not in a boardroom in a CBD after a long day at work. It is such a singular style. And I think it's unlike anything you would have tasted anywhere else. So it's a shock to the system.
Also, you have that, especially with something like Fino Manzanillo, the idea that you're saying to people that it's really worth persevering with. And I suppose a normal person might also think, well, why should I? I don't need to like one more thing. But I don't know, maybe because we are sometimes so enthusiastic about it, we don't let them get away with the idea of not liking something that they could like. I suppose part of that comes from, when we were younger, there were probably foods we didn't like as toddlers or even as adolescents that suddenly become your favourite thing when you're a little bit older. So perhaps we're aware of that, and perhaps don't want people to give up too easily on some taste sensations, just knowing, I guess, what they can possibly give you.
I think people do need to understand that your tastes change and evolve with time and with experience and with life experience as well. And you may never get to love Fino Sherry or Mathenia, but you might learn to love a lighter style of red. For example, lots of people start with Shiraz and Cabernet and then end up being completely obsessed with Pinot Noir. That's a very common trajectory amongst wine lovers. People start with, really intense, beautiful Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc and then move on to more subtle, perhaps Italian varietals that are much more textural rather than about the upfront fruit. So I guess the message I always like to say is, just give yourself a little bit of room to evolve in your tastes and don't write anything off straight away. You might find that actually over time and with more experience that you start to see different things in those wines and different facets and enjoy them for what they are.
Yeah, and I suppose also that journey does amplify outwards, but it doesn't just go one way. You often slide back to other things. You don't just travel from sweet to dry. You often, slide up and down that journey as well in sweet wines or riper, fruitier styles to savoury styles and back again. So I suppose there's also that awareness that it's not, as I say, just a linear process of going down this path and refining things. It's actually, as your universe gets bigger, I suppose, you travel in a more indirect way to wherever you're going, and it tends to just get a little bit more rich as you go.
That's so true. Absolutely. And when you're paying attention to what's in the glass, you start to see much more detail, I suppose, and get much more enjoyment than just when you're drinking in a more unconscious way. And I think that's part of the whole thing with wine is it isn't a linear path. It is a meandering path, and you come and go in terms of different styles, and you get a huge amount of enjoyment along the way. There is no one destination either.
So I had a couple of years, you said, in Amsterdam. What next?
And then I had made up my mind that I wanted to study wine full time. And I had decided to apply for a program in Bordeaux. It was a program run by the Chamber of Commerce in Bordeaux, a full year of study, really trying to get French professionals to migrate to the wine industry. And they did accept a few foreign students, and I applied for that program. And as it turned out, I was working in travel at the time, and 9/11 happened, and our travel business was massively exposed because we were bringing American high school students over to Europe for educational tours, and that market just disappeared overnight. I was actually laid off from my job right at the same time I was about to interview for this school. Kind of, again, perfect timing. No one ever wants to get laid off, but if you're going to get laid off in Holland, where they have a huge amount of protection as an employee. So I got paid out way more than my experience would suggest I should have, probably. And then I had this free time and I had salary. And so I ended up going to France a little bit ahead of time just to get my French up to speed.
And where we're having this conversation in Australia, Bordeaux, funnily enough, doesn't actually get spoken about as much as many other regions, despite the fact that obviously it would be one of the first two names on the team sheet when you talk about production and also fame, generally speaking. What are we missing out on when we don't talk about Bordeaux enough?
It's fascinating how we're not talking about Bordeaux because of how big it is in terms of its impact on the world of wine. You can go to a lot, and I'm sure you've had this experience, a lot of amazing dinners. People bring out wines from their cellar and they all look fantastic. And then someone brings out an aged Cru Classé from Margaux, Pauillac, or somewhere. And it ends up being wine of the night because Bordeaux, when it's cellared well from a good year, is stupendously delicious and ages so gracefully. It's out of fashion globally because I think it's been so famous and so big for so long that the wine world has kind of moved against it, almost as it's so popular and we couldn't possibly like it anymore. The Bordelais themselves probably haven't been as proactive in our market here in Australia compared to some of their competitors in other French wine regions either. But I'm utterly convinced Bordeaux's coming back, and soon. It's not all what you think it is. I think that's the other thing about Bordeaux is that we think of, all of the 1855 classified estates, all of the big names, and there's just so much more happening in the region and younger innovative producers, biodynamics, organically growing estates, and they're not getting any airplay, but they're there and they're doing great stuff and their wines are affordable.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's sort of almost viewed as one monolith, and I think the
Yeah.
respect is there in a way, but it's not necessarily an engaged respect. It's almost an institution, as people would view it, that they walk past every day and go, well, there it is, that grand building, but I don't think I'll go in there.
Yeah, I think it will definitely change. Last year I did a Cabernet masterclass in Sydney and one in Melbourne, and we just looked at Cabernet wines from many different countries, top stuff from Italy, Bordeaux, of course, Australia, and South America, Argentina, etc., etc. And honestly, the Cabernets across the board were exceptional, and they just are glorious, super enjoyable wines at 10 years of age and more. If you get a Cabernet in the glass and you hand it to someone, they're going to really enjoy it, especially if it's got some age on it.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think a lot of people who may be a little bit earlier on in their wine drinking trajectory, I suppose, tend to stick to things that they know that they love. And when presented with something different, quite often, yes, they find it really interesting that all these novelties, as in these lesser known varieties, these styles they've never heard of, far-flung places, they're very exotic and they comment on them because they open their mind to a certain degree. But I find it amazing how much you go back then to something supposedly basic, a real staple, and how that recognition that they have, and it's a recognition of, yeah, that actually smells good and tastes good and I like that, really happens with things like Shiraz and Cabernet and things that you'd think were around them all the time, but they're kind of not. So it's really interesting how those fashions move at different speeds and they don't always necessarily intersect with the wine drinker as well, because they're traveling at different speeds.
Yeah, and I do also wonder whether there's an intimidation factor. I mean, you just say the word Bordeaux and you come up with a vision of a, formal chateau and people in suits and a sort of barrier in terms of price and prestige, and that doesn't gel well with the vast majority of wine drinkers, and justifiably so. But I guess my message is that Bordeaux is so much more than that.
So how did you end up here after Bordeaux?
How did I end up here? So I was lured to Australia by my husband, John. So I met John in Bordeaux, actually. During that week, I was interviewing for the school that I went to. He was traveling through, I think we both had the same copy of Lonely Planet France and about the same budget as well. And so he ended up on the same wine tour of the Médoc that I was on, and we hit it off and did a kind of long distance thing for a little bit. And then after I finished my program in Bordeaux, I moved to Sydney in 2003.
Well, there you go. That shatters the idea that Bordeaux isn't the region of romance when it comes to wine.
Yeah. It's quite a remarkable story because we went back on our honeymoon to Bordeaux and we decided to do another tour, and turns out that the woman who ran that tour was the same woman. Nothing changes in France. And so we went up to her after the tour and just said, hey, just letting you know that we met on this tour 6 years ago. And she was over the moon. She's like, oh, I'm at the heart of a love story, blah, blah, blah. And it was just really cute to see that. Yeah, she said, there's many other stories like this that people have met on these tours.
Excellent. Well, there's another reason to get into wine.
Indeed.
So when you got to Australia, what was the first gig that you had here?
Yeah, so I ended up working for a small wholesaler called Seller Connection at the time, and it was owned by Wayne Light, who's still in the wine trade in Melbourne. And that was fantastic work experience. Wayne is a total character and we're still in touch today, and he always makes me laugh, and he's quite a fun ball of energy and an absolute sales gun. And so I learned a lot about that from him. After a few months though, I decided that I was probably better suited to retail, and so I ended up working for Dan Murphy's just as they were rolling out into Sydney.
Very above averagely worldly, I suppose, in your experience by that stage. Was it nice to sink your teeth into the curiosity of those consumers?
It was, and in fact, it was a massive learning curve for me because, yes, worldly in one sense, I knew quite a lot about, frankly, Bordeaux and a little bit about other wine regions in Europe and almost nothing about Australian wine. And of course, the vast majority of wine I was selling was Australian, and I had no idea how to pronounce half of the place names either. So I had customers correcting my pronunciation on a frequent basis. So I learned so much in those early days.
I feel like sometimes Australia's not necessarily as strong as you might feel in putting itself forward at what it's good at. It's rather self-deprecating, and there can be a bit of cultural cringe sometimes about styles, or certainly generationally, maybe it goes in cycles. There's pride, and then there's a bit of shrinking away from that pride. Did you engage with many winemakers, and what were those first interactions like?
It was quite an amazing time, actually. Just as I was starting, probably some of the 2002 South Australian Reds were starting to appear, and that was a stupendously good vintage. And I would be tasting those and going along to trade tastings and sometimes winemaker dinners and things, and learning about the different vintage conditions from the late 90s into the early 2000s, and also learning a fair bit about the Australian mentality surrounding wine, which at the time was very much like, we can make anything really good from any part of the country at any time we want. Like, there was a very sort of technological, obsessive focus, and there wasn't any mention of the word, terroir, or this idea of single vineyard expression or any of this. It was still very much we just pick the best grapes, blend it to the best of our ability, and make most awesome wine. And frankly, in the glass, that was pretty true most of the time, particularly in the mid-market selection of wine. But overall, quality-wise, I was so impressed with what Australia was making. And there were styles I had never tried, like Hunter Valley Semillon. And the first time I tried an aged Semillon, I was utterly convinced it must have been aged at oak. Where do you get all this toasty character from? That was a complete revelation.
You live in Sydney. Does that make you an automatic regular Semillon drinker?
Not as frequent as I ought to, and I will fully admit that. I talk about Hunter Semillon more than I drink it, which is ridiculously stupid. And I've just tried some tank samples, you could say, from the 25 Semillons from Andrew Thomas, and my goodness, they are the bee's knees. They are just looking fabulous. And if they look that good in tank, imagine what they'll be looking like in bottle. So I'm super excited. I'll be buying those. I'll be buying a fair bit of 25 Semillon, I think.
Well, I reckon that's a very early call for that 2025
Yes,
Semillons.
yes.
Called in the first week of March. A great year.
That's right, yeah.
Just looking ahead then to what you're doing now, which is teaching with your own business. Tell us more about that.
I had always done a little bit of teaching on the side throughout my career. So even at Dan Murphy's, I was running my team through little mini master classes in our own time. Didn't get paid to do it. And somehow I managed to convince my team to stay back for an hour. I don't even know how this happened back then, but I remember really enjoying that. And I never thought of myself as an educator per se, as in that's all I ever want to do. And then I ended up working at Farm One Auction with Langtons, and then during that time I was still doing a little bit of education, and then on to Qantas as well, where I was doing a little bit of education for our team, but also the broader Qantas corporates as well as customers, and then also moonlighting a little bit with Prince Wine Store as well as a WSET educator. And then when I left Qantas, I had a little clause in my contract that said, well, you can't be a buyer, for a period of time because you had all of this very sensitive information. So I thought, well, no, I'll actually set myself up as an education business, and that'll be a small sideline, and then I'll get my hands into online retail. And then the education side just took off, and I've never actually managed to use my online liquor license for anything other than buying wholesale for the education business, really.
Teaching obviously is something that people turn to when they are knowledgeable and smart and potentially have something to share, but at the same time, to really be good at it, to really enjoy it, it has to be, I think, something that's really in you. It has to give you a buzz, and clearly it does. What is it about teaching, and specifically teaching wine, that you find so rewarding?
I do get a buzz out of it every single time, every single class. And I think there's a few reasons for that. One, I love seeing people come in, be a little bit unsure about describing wine, or about even confidently asking for wine or whatever in a restaurant situation, and then come out of class, even after the first class, going, oh, I finally understand that, and I know how to pronounce it, and I know what it's going to smell or taste like, and now I'm going to go and try 3 more of those, and I'm going to share them with my friends or my family and go from there. And you just see this literally light go on and people discover brand new wines, whether it's new regions, new varieties, new styles that they've never had before. And this curiosity just grows and grows and grows. So I absolutely love seeing that. And the other thing I absolutely love is the sense of community that seems to be forged in my wine classes. And that's not something that I had really actively thought about when I started the business, but was quickly apparent that here was a group of strangers coming together for a wine class every Monday or Tuesday evening for 8 or 9 weeks. And by the end of that time, many of them had formed friendships, informal tasting groups, and many of those tasting groups still meet up today. For me, that sense of community through wine has been another great joy in starting this education business and seeing it flourish.
I think it's almost certainly a real confluence of factors that make wine classes so like that. And it is surprising. I'm sure there are people who think, and I even think of it when I see the expectations of people the first time that they walk into these classrooms, that it's quite nerve-wracking and that it might be a chore. Within no time at all, they seem to be bonding over it. The second class in, they'll be nattering away about things that they've drunk and things that they discovered and what they're looking forward to. And I assume that there are generally a few things sort of happening at the same time there. A little bit of perhaps that vulnerability that they have when they first do it, that they don't know if they're going to enjoy it, if they're going to look stupid, and they're going through that vulnerability together. And I think even as more advanced students, you kind of have that sense quite often that you're really insecure and you get over it, and it's quite nice to be surrounded by the same people that you got through it with. That never dies, I don't think. And, it's a fun subject. You're not just sitting in a classroom learning something new, but you are going to places with other people, and that sense of shared experience runs deeper than it does in a lot of other subjects because it is sensory, and it is also giving you permission to dwell on beautiful places all over the world. And I think that is a bit of a doorway onto pleasure.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're literally traveling as you're tasting through, a series of wines, and you're learning about those places, and you're thinking about where these grapes were grown and the people who made them and their philosophies. And that makes you want to go there. So you're actually vicariously traveling while you're in the classroom, but then you might start literally kind of Googling like flights to Italy, flights to Germany, etc. Yeah, I love that. It brings that travel element and that discovery element together, and that agricultural element too, which I think was always lurking in my background as a sort of sense of fascination too.
Yeah, and perhaps another thing, a bit like travel, you don't leave the classroom the same as you entered it, because during that hour or 2 hours, you've heard other people speak and put themselves forward, and they're often from other places bringing other experiences to it. And all of that sort of feeds into your interpretation of what you're doing. It's not a fixed subject. So everyone's learning, and even the person at the front of the class is listening to all these reactions and noting them and actually enriching their own responses to these things. So even as an educator, it's one of those really cool things that you never stop learning from your students. Not necessarily learning technical things, but just learning to put some more shades into your experience of these things, and also what they mean to other people and which buttons they press. I think that's why people come back week after week with that sense of excitement, because they know that they're sort of changing.
Yes, yeah, they do. They change in those 8 or 9 weeks that you run that course. They change for good. I always tell them it's a bit of a slippery slope. You start perhaps with WSET level 2, and then, soon enough you're signed up for level 3, and then you're sort of eyeing off the diploma, and you think, my goodness, like a year and a half ago, I didn't know the difference between Shiraz and Cabernet, and now I'm talking about, sub-regional expressions. But as an educator, I also get that feedback from my students in terms of they're constantly asking me questions from an angle that I wouldn't necessarily have considered. And you learn so much from listening to the questions from people who haven't had that experience yet. And you understand kind of the gaps in information that sometimes the wine industry inadvertently has.
Yeah, and when it comes to education, your journey basically has gone as far as journeys can go. The Master of Wine, probably something that lots of people are sort of aware of. They've seen those initials after people's names. What does the MW program sort of mean to you?
The program was the most arduous, difficult, challenging, crazy thing I've ever thought of doing. Sometimes I think back on it and I was just so naive, perhaps, and maybe through naivete, you actually don't know what you're about to go through, and that might be a good thing. I met so many amazing people And while I was doing my studies, many of whom are still very, very good friends of mine today. I think there's something about being in such a challenging environment. It really does bond you to people. I sometimes think the MW does train you to not only have the capacity to taste well and to really understand the world of wine, but it also does train other aspects of you in terms of dealing with huge pressure and huge kind of expectation and how to kind of be calm in a most uncalm environment you can imagine, which is just this one shot a year at these exams. So it's now almost 10 years since I became an MW, which is hard to believe. And I absolutely know that it has opened many, many doors for me since I became an MW. But I also know that I am the same person I was the day before they announced that I became an MW. And so I always try and bring that to whatever environment I'm in. And you know what it's like to be struggling and striving and trying to achieve something. And it's not always instant success. And sometimes it's not success at all. So I keep that in mind every day. For me, the most important thing after becoming an MW is having the capacity to give back. And so I've been really active in the Institute, both on the education side, supervise the exams from time to time, and then also now I'm on the council, which is the board. So really trying to give back to the Institute and give back my time because I recognize so many people gave back their time to help me as a student.
Yeah, and I guess in so many ways, the learning never stops as well. Not just those other things that you felt before you became a Master of Wine, but of course, you keep your eyes open and you keep going to places and keep being stimulated by amazingly stimulating company in very impressive surrounds. Give us an idea of some of the places that you visited last year.
Last year was quite exceptional, or maybe it was the year before. I've had some crazy, crazy years, but one of the great things about being a Master of Wine are the trips that they put together for MWs. And so I was in late 2023 on a trip to South Africa. I'd never been to the continent and I'd never been to South Africa. And to spend, 10 days in the winelands of South Africa on what has to be the 5-star tour was just absolutely phenomenal. And you're traveling, with your tribe. So with all these quite geeky, quite like-minded MWs who ask all of the questions that are in your head that are quite technical or a bit strange or left field, etc. in terms of professional development. As you said, you can't just stop learning. It's not like you get these letters and then like, yeah, I know everything. In fact, it's just the beginning, and you just always are continuously trying to keep your knowledge of wine regions current. And particularly when you're an educator, that's even more important because your students expect you to be absolutely current across huge swathe of the wine world. So South Africa, I've been to Alsace and the Jura last year on an MW trip. Other trips have been to Oregon, Washington State, Israel many years ago when times were much easier.
Yeah, well, I won't pretend that it was an entirely selfless sacrifice to go to South Africa, and I certainly won't pretend that I wasn't jealous because I haven't been there and would love to go. But as you say, it is really important to have people feeding back into the ecosystem, and that is an ecosystem not just of knowledge, it's an ecosystem of curiosity as well, I suppose. You kind of have to go away, you have to mix with people, you have to continually renew your understanding of things to be able to keep that curiosity burning and to let it feed others. I mean, we're all, I suppose, cogs in the same wheel of curiosity and learning at the end of the day, no matter where we are in that wheel. Now, I won't keep you much longer, but I have got another couple of questions if you've got time.
Yeah.
First of all, it would be, again, slightly remiss of me not to mention, especially while you're there in the Hunter Valley, where you must always get a little bit of a frisson, I'm sure, of pride at the fact that you took part in the Len Evans tutorial a couple of years ago with the best crew, and you even managed to beat some of that competition to the title of Ducks. Of course, it's not a competition. I think it's really important to remember that, especially as I didn't win. But also, in all seriousness, it is an amazing learning week, what they have called, and I think with some justification, the greatest wine school on earth. How much sort of anticipation was there for you before that, and what did you get out of it?
A huge amount of anticipation. I had always wanted to be part of the Len Evans tutorial ever since I moved to Australia. I remember reading about it when I first arrived and going, how do I get myself onto this? So, it took many, many attempts to even get to the starting line. The two motivations I had really for doing Len Evans tutorial was, one, a chance to taste this amazing array of back vintage wine, particularly Australian wine. that you will never get a chance to taste in your lifetime otherwise, and to understand that whole canon of fine wine from Australia as well as the world. And two, to really kind of benchmark my tasting and ability to judge, because at the time, and I still am, judging internationally at Decanter World Wine Awards in London. And, I have a sense of where I sit, but you can't be complacent. You kind of need to understand in an Australian show system, how does my palate perform? Those were primary motivations. But then when we had our sort of first Zoom call, because it was all announced during, COVID lockdown and all of that, and got online and saw all of you guys online, and just, I was, this is such an amazing group of people, and I can't wait to spend a week with everyone and getting to know all of these amazing people from across the country.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you a difficult question that I don't know how I would answer, but I'll preface that with something that I do know, and that is that the wine was an enormous privilege, and certainly learning with other people, both sitting around you in the classroom, the nervous bodies in the chairs around you, and also, of course, the incredible caliber of people who were teaching us, because it is a tutorial, and observing us. A huge amount that comes out of that. For me personally as well, it wouldn't even almost need to be wine to say that it's such a privilege to just stop and look at something grown on earth in such detail, with such time in your hands, to do nothing else for a week, but just look at things of incredible composition and beauty that took someone somewhere time to produce, that everyone's focusing on in a minute way in a room somewhere and then discussing. Just the idea of just being so in a place, in a time, to have the luxury of contemplating something like that over and over again,
yes,
I thought was really marvellous. And my question that's more difficult to answer, how would you explain the relevance of it, I suppose, for those who aren't there? Why is it important that this exists?
I think it's even more relevant than it has been historically for a couple of reasons. One is that we are starting to lose sight, and there's been a lot of anti-wine messaging and kind of anti-drinking messaging. And I'm not for 1 minute advocating that people should be drinking large volumes of wine on a daily basis or anything like that. But we have lost a little bit of the message about how amazing and special it is to have a glass of fine wine, and what fine wine really is. And that sense of, as you said before, being able to sit and speak about this liquid in the glass that someone took so much time and care and attention to craft, and that evolves in the glass, and that has perhaps lasted 60 or 70 or 80 years or more. To be able to enjoy that and see that for its significance in terms of pleasure, but also in terms of historical value, is super important. If you don't taste those wines, if you never have a chance to taste that caliber of fine wine as a wine professional, then you're missing a part of the story and a part of your own education. That's something that Len already knew and was very, very fierce advocate for. You're never going to be the best winemaker or the best wine educator or the best wine salesperson if you don't know what the best wines taste like.
Yeah, hopefully it does make more sense, I suppose, if people who have taken part in it are able to get out and about and communicate it. It's just the very fact that it places value on wonder.
Yeah.
Yes, it's about quality, but it's also about the quality, I suppose, of thinking and appreciation in general, and reflection.
I agree. And, it's important we don't lose sight of the magic of wine. And it doesn't have to be the most expensive wine you've ever had, but it has to be a wine that makes you stop in your tracks and really take a moment to contemplate all of the nuances that you can enjoy in the glass. And it will often open other conversations. I mean, that's part of my overall philosophy with wine in general, is that, you start with this liquid in the glass, and then the conversation goes beyond that to often really deep and meaningful subject matter, whether, it's politics or the state of the climate or, family, what have you.
Right.
And so wine takes
the magic is other people.
The magic is other people, and wine opens the door to all of that.
Let's just get to you. What are those things that you particularly love drinking?
I absolutely adore Riesling. Everyone knows that. My students all know that now. And I always will, and I'm never going to change my stripes. I'm always drinking Riesling and always interested in seeing what other Rieslings are coming up from other parts of the country and the world. And I like old styles, but I probably do love the Mosel cabinet styles the most, and I find them the most refreshing. So I'm a big fan. But then I'm always trying new things that I haven't had before, and I really enjoy seeing what's up and coming, whether that's the unfortified palominos of Jerez, everything that's coming out of Etna, which is super interesting, whether that's the Caricante in white and Neralo Mascalese in the red, Sardinia, Corsica. I'm a little bit obsessed by island wine at the moment. I think that's quite interesting. There's some interesting things coming out of the Azores as well.
That's a bit ahead of me.
Yeah, no, I had no idea. As again, you go to trade tastings and you try these things and you think, wow, I had no idea what was going on there. So I'm constantly curious about what's next, what's around the corner. And at the same time, I have a few favorites that I kind of buy over and over again. And I drink a lot of rosé as well, which some of my students find quite shocking, but I really like rosé and find it really refreshing and enjoyable, especially in Sydney throughout the summer and throughout the year, frankly.
I asked you to turn the air conditioning off, and we've been talking for a long time, so you're probably getting quite thirsty, I would say, by now. What are you going to drink tonight?
Well, I'll probably drink potentially a Hunter Shiraz, I think, since I'm in the region. Yeah, so I'll be drinking some of those tonight. And really like to drink local wine when I'm in a place and get a sense of what's happening on the ground here in the recent vintages. And yeah, I'll be enjoying that.
That's it for this week's podcast. If you like what you heard, please like it, subscribe, pass it on. All that means so much. You can also subscribe to my Substack. That's edmerison.substack.com. Comments are massively welcome. Let me know what you'd like to hear more of. In the meantime, huge thanks to my friends Lucas James for the music, Neil Williams for the artwork, and to my guest, Andrea Pritzker MW of Wine Intuition. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers.